We've got some major developments to go over regarding the national effort to take short-barreled rifles and sound suppressors off the National Firearms Act once and for all. For those of you who've been keeping track, you already know that both the Hearing Protection Act and the Short Act were folded into House Resolution 1, what folks are calling the Big Beautiful Bill. The catch? These measures only eliminated the $200 transfer tax. That's it. They didn't wipe out the rest of the National Firearms Act's overreach. Because of that half step, a wave of legal action is now underway, aiming to dismantle what remains of the registry requirements and the outdated, unconstitutional rules still clinging to short-barreled rifles and silencers. Let's break this all down. As we mentioned, House Resolution 1 recently cleared Congress. Inside it were versions of the Hearing Protection Act and the Short Act, but instead of scrapping the National Firearms Act's grip on these items, they only zeroed out the tax. That means the mandatory $200 fee to register things like suppressors or short-barreled rifles was dropped to nothing. While that's a small win, let's be honest, it's far from the full repeal many of us were hoping for. Personally, I wanted to see the entire framework of the National Firearms Act gutted when it comes to silencers and short-barreled weapons. But, unsurprisingly, several so-called moderate lawmakers in the Republican Party didn't have the spine to push for the whole repeal. They weren't even willing to remove the Senate parliamentarian to make it happen. So what we ended up with was a bill that just removed the fee but kept all the rest of the unconstitutional baggage. But here's the thing, this isn't the end. Not by a long shot. With that tax now officially eliminated, pro-Second Amendment organizations have already stepped up to the plate and filed lawsuits to tear down the remaining parts of the National Firearms Act. Gun Owners of America, the Firearms Regulatory Accountability Coalition, Palmetto State Armory, and Silencerco have joined forces to sue the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives directly. And that's just the beginning. I've heard through solid channels that another major lawsuit is coming down the pipe, this one from the Firearms Policy Coalition, the National Rifle Association, the Second Amendment Foundation, and most likely the American Suppressor Association. They're all preparing to file challenges of their own to wipe out what's left of these unconstitutional regulations. The fight to restore our rights isn't over, it's just heating up. In their recently filed lawsuit, Gun Owners of America and several allied groups argue that the National Firearms Act, first passed back in the year 1934, was entirely grounded in Congress's constitutional authority to levy taxes. At the time, the law slapped a $200 tax on the production and transfer of certain categories of firearms, including suppressors, short-barreled rifles, and other restricted items. The lawmakers behind the NFA were explicit. This was a tax statute, and the United States Supreme Court upheld it on that narrow basis. That legal understanding has stood, largely unchallenged, for nearly 100 years. But everything changed on Independence Day, July 4, 2025, when House Resolution 1, informally known as the One Big Beautiful Bill, officially took effect. One of its key provisions was eliminating the $200 transfer tax on nearly all items that fall under the National Firearms Act. What that effectively means is this: the central constitutional pillar that supported the NFA Congress's taxing power no longer exists for the vast majority of firearms the NFA attempts to regulate. Without that taxation in place, the law can no longer be justified under Article 1 of the Constitution. GOA and its fellow plaintiffs argue that while the transfer tax was zeroed out, the federal government left in place all of the NFA's restrictions such as mandatory registration, approval for manufacturing, and transfer limitations. but without an active tax being enforced alongside those regulations, the law now floats without any constitutional anchor. That's why the plaintiffs, both individuals and firearm-focused organizations, are asking the federal court to rule that the NFA is unconstitutional when applied to these now untaxed firearms. They are also seeking an order that would block the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, and other federal officials from enforcing any of those restrictions. Specifically, the lawsuit brings two major claims. First, it asks for a declaratory judgment, that is, a formal ruling that says the National Firearms Act, as it currently stands, overreaches the authority granted to Congress under Article 1. Second, it seeks an injunction to stop the ATF and federal agents from enforcing any NFA-related rules or mandates on untaxed weapons, such as short-barreled rifles, short-barreled shotguns, sound suppressors, and items classified as any other weapons. The legal action has been filed in the Northern District of Texas, a jurisdiction that has become well known for delivering favorable rulings in Second Amendment litigation. Some of the more prominent wins out of this court include the Vanderstock case that dealt with so-called 80% receivers, and the Mock case that took on the ATF's overreach with pistol braces. What gun owners are now hoping for is a judge like Reed O'Connor, someone who has consistently shown a clear understanding of firearms law and how federal agencies often stretch their regulatory authority. Still, no matter how strong the district court ruling may be, an appeal is almost guaranteed. This case will be pushed up to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, where things get more complex. Following a recent 6-3 ruling by the Supreme Court, broad nationwide injunctions are no longer on the table. So even if the plaintiffs win at the circuit level, any relief would likely be limited to members of the involved organizations or customers of the named companies. Furthermore, the Fifth Circuit has a history of issuing temporary stays on rulings in Second Amendment cases, meaning any decision to strike down the NFA's enforcement mechanisms would probably be paused until the Supreme Court has a chance to weigh in. Of course, if the court were to strike down the NFA's core framework as unconstitutional, that would benefit gun owners across the country. But realistically, even if that kind of victory happens, expect the Fifth Circuit to delay implementation for the sake of judicial caution. That's not just speculation, it's based on what we've seen play out in multiple past challenges out of this same district. There's one big variable in all of this, and that's how the Trump-era ATF will actually respond to this new legal challenge. Based on how the agency has handled other Second Amendment-related lawsuits over the past year or so, there's a possibility we might see an early shift or even a favorable outcome without the courts needing to push too hard. The Trump administration's ATF has already walked back positions in multiple high-profile cases, and that trend could continue here. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if the ATF itself ends up acknowledging that eliminating the $200 transfer tax fundamentally undercuts the legal foundation of the National Firearms Act. If they admit that they no longer have clear authority to enforce registration and transfer restrictions on items like short-barreled rifles or suppressors now that those items are untaxed, it would be a significant concession. That said, this wouldn't be the first time we've seen the Trump administration take bold or unexpected stances on issues involving the right to keep and bear arms. For now, all eyes are on the judge who ends up presiding over this case. The outcome could heavily depend on whether we get someone who truly understands both the Second Amendment and the limits of federal regulatory power, someone like Judge Reed O'Connor, who has a solid track record in this area. Now that both the Hearing Protection Act and the Short Act have cleared Congress with that $0 tax language, The lawsuits are rolling forward to wipe out the rest of the unconstitutional debris Congress left behind. Credit where it's due. Gun Owners of America, along with the other organizations involved, stepped up and are doing the heavy legal lifting to restore our rights. Their goal is clear: eliminate the leftover mandates from the National Firearms Act that have no constitutional footing now that the tax structure has been gutted. As this case moves forward, I'll be keeping a close eye on developments and keeping you updated along the way. If you want to support what we're doing here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. You can also swing by my website armscholar.com, where you'll find our free legal resource guide, channel gear, and exclusive deals that help support the channel while saving you some money. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and remember, this country was founded by armed scholars, and it's going to take armed scholars to preserve it.